December 1944, the Ardennes. The forest is silent except for the dull crunch of boots over frozen snow. A small group of American infantrymen huddle beside an idling half-track, their faces gray with exhaustion. They've been fighting for days without hot food, their breath curling in the icy air. One of them kneels in the mud, strikes a match, and holds it beneath a dented tin can. The flame flickers weakly against the wind. The label reads, C-Ration meat and beans. A metallic pop. The soldier grimaces at the smell. Greasy, stale, a hint of rust and smoke. He mutters something under his breath, takes a bite, and forces it down. Around him, others laugh wearily, trading cans like poker chips. I'll swap my meat hash for your biscuits. To them, the C-Ration is both a curse and a lifeline. Hated, yet indispensable. 6 months later, across a shattered Europe, German prisoners of war sit quietly inside barbed wire enclosures. U.S. guards distribute the same dull cans, stamped with the same olive-drab labels. The Germans open them, hesitating, hungry beyond pride, and stare in disbelief at what's inside. They'd never seen rations like these before. And that's where the story begins. With a tin can that fed an army and stunned its enemies. In the years before America entered the Second World War, the U.S. Army faced a question that went far beyond strategy or weapons. How to feed millions of men fighting across the world. The lessons of World War I still echoed through the halls of the U.S. Quartermaster Corps. Soldiers in 1918 had often gone hungry, dependent on field kitchens that couldn't keep up with the front. By 1940, military planners knew that the next war would be faster, more mobile, and far more distant. Armies would move hundreds of miles without returning to base. Food, like fuel and ammunition, needed to travel with them. That challenge birthed one of the most overlooked revolutions in military history, the combat ration. At Fort Myer and the Quartermaster Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago, a small group of food scientists, dietitians, and engineers began designing a meal that could survive heat, moisture, transport, and time. It had to fit inside a soldier's pack, resist spoilage for years, and deliver enough calories to march, dig, and fight. Their solution was a compact, all-weather meal sealed in metal, the C-Ration. Introduced in 1939 and standardized by 1941, it came in 3 cylindrical cans. One for meat, one for bread or biscuits, one for dessert. It included powdered coffee, sugar tablets, and even a tiny can opener, the famous P38. Each ration delivered roughly 3,700 calories, designed to sustain a soldier for 1 day in the field. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't meant to be, but it worked. While the War Department focused on tanks and bombers, the Quartermaster Corps quietly launched one of the largest logistical experiments in history. Factories from Illinois to California converted production lines to fill tin cans with stews, beans, and hash at industrial speed. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 1.5 billion C-Rations were produced, enough to feed an army across continents. The system was precise, almost scientific. Ingredients were balanced for nutrition, not taste. Labels were coded by menu: B for meat and beans, M for meat and vegetable hash, S for spaghetti and meat. Soldiers called them meals in a tin, but with time and exhaustion, new nicknames appeared: C-Rats, Combat Chow, or simply the Terrible Cans. They joked that eating one required courage. They joked, but they still ate. Behind every shipment was the might of American industry. Rail cars, Liberty ships, and convoys carried the same green tins from New Jersey to North Africa, from England to the Philippines. The uniformity of that dull olive paint became a symbol of American logistics, mass production feeding millions in every theater. The C-Ration wasn't just food. It was mobility, independence, and predictability. Every soldier knew that no matter where he was sent, a meal would follow, sealed in tin, stamped U.S. Army. That simple truth separated America's armies from almost every other force in the war. Next came the true test, the global battlefield, where America's system of canned endurance met the Axis armies still bound to old traditions of fresh supply, foraging, and dependence on territory. It was there that the real contrast appeared, and where the world began to notice the American way of feeding war. By the time American forces landed in North Africa in late 1942, the C-Ration was no longer an experiment, it was a lifeline. Deserts, jungles, and snowfields all shared one constant: hunger. Fresh food couldn't survive the journey, field kitchens lagged miles behind, and local resources were unreliable or non-existent. The U.S. Army had decided that mobility meant self-sufficiency, and self-sufficiency meant a soldier carried his own sustenance. In Tunisia, GIs unrolled their packs to reveal rows of dull, heavy cans. The labels read meat and vegetable hash, beef stew, or spaghetti with meat. When German and Italian prisoners saw them for the first time, they mistook them for officer luxuries, perhaps emergency stores for generals or aircrews. But soon they learned these tins were issued to every American rifleman, from the private in the foxhole to the sergeant leading the charge. To the Wehrmacht, the contrast was stunning. German soldiers still relied on field kitchens, the Gulaschkanone, a toad cauldron that served stews cooked from fresh meat and bread brought up by wagon. It worked well when supply lines were intact, when the front was stable, when the skies were clear. But in North Africa, when Allied air power shattered convoys and sandstorms swallowed roads, the old method collapsed. American troops, meanwhile, kept moving. The same Liberty ships that carried tanks also carried millions of cans, packed in crates marked subsistence, Type C. By 1943, the logistical advantage was clear. In Sicily and Italy, as Allied forces slogged through mountains and mud, soldiers learned to live from tin. Complaints grew louder. The food was bland, monotonous, greasy when cold. Yet morale held, because no matter how bad it tasted, it was always there. German troops advancing or retreating often depended on what they could seize: local livestock, bakeries, farms. When territory disappeared, so did food. The Japanese in the Pacific faced an even harsher fate. Their soldiers carried rice balls, dried fish, or barley, meant for days, not months. Once cut off by sea or air, starvation followed swiftly. The American system was brutally efficient. Factories in Chicago, Baltimore, and San Francisco operated around the clock. Convoys of refrigerated trucks, trains, and ships created an unbroken chain of nutrition from the heartland to the foxhole. For every rifle fired in Europe, somewhere in America a machine stamped another can. In letters home, GIs called the food awful, slimy, or just edible enough. They joked about trading cans with the British, one of ours for two of theirs. Yet when hunger came, jokes stopped. The ritual of puncturing a tin, heating it with a match, and swallowing lukewarm beans under artillery fire became a part of soldiering. The Quartermaster Corps continued refining the menus, adding chocolate, cigarettes, and instant coffee. Nutritionists debated vitamins and caloric density, but soldiers cared about one thing: something warm to eat in the mud. The C-Ration symbolized the American soldier's strange duality: complaining constantly, yet surviving better than anyone else. By the time D-Day approached, warehouses in Britain held mountains of C-Rations stacked to the ceiling. Each crate represented 12 men for one day. When the invasion began, over 20 million individual rations crossed the channel within weeks. Every beachhead, every hedgerow, every foxhole in Normandy was supplied by the same can design born 5 years earlier in Chicago. It was a small, gray miracle of consistency, a victory of planning over circumstance. The Germans noticed. So did the British. Even Soviet officers visiting Allied depots marveled at the abundance and precision. The tin that soldiers despised had become a quiet symbol of industrial strength. But on the ground, among the mud and exhaustion, the men didn't see strategy or science, only the metallic taste of another meal. And that's where the story turns personal. To the men who lived on these rations, cursed them daily, and later realized what they truly meant. To the men who carried them, C-Rations were less a triumph of science and more a test of patience. The U.S. soldier lived with the can as he lived with his rifle, always near, often cursed, never abandoned. In the foxholes of Italy, the jungles of New Guinea, and the snow of Belgium, those small olive tins clattered in mess kits and backpacks, constant reminders that comfort had been replaced by necessity. Open a C-Ration and the smell came first: tinned meat, metallic syrup, stale biscuits. The texture could turn a stomach, especially when cold. Soldiers called the meat and vegetable hash dog food, and the pork and beans earned a dozen unprintable nicknames. Yet for all the complaints, few forgot that it filled an empty stomach when nothing else could. Letters from the front carried a familiar tone, humor wrapped around exhaustion. A GI in Italy wrote, "If I survive this war, I'll never eat beans again." Another described the flavor as machine oil mixed with regret. But others, hardened by hunger, came to appreciate its consistency. Terrible, they admitted, but it keeps you alive. The ritual of eating became almost mechanical. Men used bayonets to punch holes in the lids, or fired a burst from a Thompson to open a stubborn can. Coffee was brewed in helmets, biscuits crushed into improvised porridge. Even in foxholes under shellfire, they learned to heat food on rifle barrels or engine blocks. Improvisation turned disgust into endurance. In that way, the C-Ration became something more than food. It became a shared experience. The jokes, trades, and minor rebellions against its taste built a strange sense of camaraderie. One soldier's hated tin of meat and spaghetti was another's small treasure when hunger struck at 2 a.m. C-Rations also bridged rank. Officers and privates ate the same thing when far from supply kitchens. There were no fine meals in a frozen forest, only tins of meat and crackers. That equality, forced but real, mattered. In a war fought by millions, the same ration united them more than flags or slogans. When replacements arrived fresh from the States, veterans would grin and hand them their first C-Ration, waiting for the reaction. The ritual never failed. A grimace, a curse, a laugh. "Welcome to the war," someone would say. To the outside world, American soldiers seemed spoiled. Well-fed, well-equipped, always supplied. To the men themselves, it was less about luxury than reliability. You might march through hell, but the can was there. It meant you weren't forgotten. And when the fighting stopped, when foxholes turned quiet and the fire died down, the C-Ration was still there, waiting beside a rifle, like a reminder of the strange blend of misery and gratitude that defined life at the front. They hated its taste, but they trusted what it represented. A promise that food would come, no matter how far the battle went. And on the other side of the lines, that promise became something else, an object of disbelief. Because when the Axis soldiers saw what America's terrible ration really was, they realized how deep the U.S. advantage went. For the Germans, the war had begun with abundance. In 1939, Wehrmacht columns rolled through Poland and France supplied by precise, well-managed field kitchens, warm stews, fresh bread, coffee brewed on wood fires. Soldiers laughed at stories of American factory food. They believed war should be fought by men, not machines, and certainly not fed by them. But as the tide turned, that confidence cracked. By 1943, in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad and the deserts of North Africa, German supply systems began to crumble under pressure. The U.S. Army's relentless logistics, convoys, pipelines, depots, and airlifts allowed Americans to eat even in chaos. The Wehrmacht, in contrast, was tied to geography. When it lost ground, it lost food. German officers who captured Allied supply dumps early in the war were stunned. They found row after row of metal crates filled with canned meat, biscuits, and fruit. All identical, all neatly stamped U.S. Army. There was no improvisation, no reliance on local harvests. To them, it seemed almost inhuman, food that came from machines instead of kitchens. Yet behind that mechanization lay a truth they couldn't ignore. It worked. As the Allies advanced across France, captured German troops began tasting the rations they'd once mocked. At first there was laughter. How could anyone eat this greasy mixture and call it food? But the laughter faded when hunger set in. Many prisoners, cut off from collapsing supply lines, hadn't eaten properly in days. Then came the cans. Accounts from U.S. guards described the same scene repeated across Europe. Prisoners tearing open C-Rations with shaking hands, eating silently, then pausing, surprised at the warmth spreading through their stomachs. To men who had been surviving on stale bread and thin soup, even the terrible American meat and beans felt miraculous. One captured German sergeant, interviewed months later, admitted, We laughed at your rations. Then we ate them. We stopped laughing. The contrast wasn't only about calories. It was psychological. Every can represented something larger. America's ability to project abundance across oceans. It was proof that the enemy they'd been told was soft, could not only fight but feed millions without pause. Japanese POWs shared similar astonishment. In camps across the Pacific, they were fed from the same stockpiles as U.S. troops. Many recorded disbelief at the sweetness, the variety. Chocolate, coffee, even fruit. To them, it was unthinkable that such luxuries could be war food. In both theaters, rations became a quiet instrument of comparison. Not propaganda from a loudspeaker, but a lesson tasted one spoonful at a time. And within that realization lay a deeper understanding. America's strength was not just in weapons or soldiers, but in systems, in the invisible machinery that kept men alive, moving, and ready to fight another day. The C-Ration, despised by those who ate it daily, became a silent ambassador of that power. To its enemies, it represented something unnerving, a nation whose factories could outfeed and outlast empires. Soon, that lesson would be learned on a massive scale, not in theory but in captivity. By the winter of 1944, the German army was starving. The once proud supply system that had fueled Blitzkrieg was now a web of broken lines, bombed railways, and burned depots. Allied air power had turned transportation into ruin. Trains carrying bread and ammunition rarely reached the front. Horses, still the backbone of German logistics, froze or died in the snow. Men boiled them for meat. When the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, began in December, many German units started the attack with only 3 days' worth of rations. Soldiers were ordered to live off the land. But there was nothing left to take. Belgian villages were empty, fields barren, livestock long gone. Then they overran American positions, and what they found shocked them. German officers who inspected captured U.S. supply points described mountains of food. Crates of canned meat, tins of fruit, chocolate, powdered eggs, coffee, enough to feed entire divisions. They ate what they could, filled their packs, and moved on. But within days, those same depots were retaken by American counterattacks. The Germans had tasted plenty, and then lost it. As the offensive collapsed, the tables turned again. Thousands of German soldiers were surrounded, their food gone, their morale evaporating. Columns of prisoners began marching west, thin, silent, hollow-eyed. The Allies now faced a humanitarian challenge almost as vast as the battle itself. How to feed the captured enemy. The solution was obvious, if ironic. The same cans that had fed U.S. soldiers under fire would now feed their enemies behind wire. By early 1945, American-run POW camps across France and Belgium were distributing millions of C-Rations per week. The process was mechanical. Prisoners lined up, received a can, a spoon, and sometimes a cigarette. At first, they ate cautiously, eyes narrowed, hands trembling. Then hunger overruled pride. Many POWs later wrote about that first American meal. It wasn't the flavor that stayed with them. It was the realization of what it represented. Even in victory, the Americans were organized, efficient, almost generous. Food came regularly, predictably, without humiliation. For soldiers who had lived on starvation rations, this was disorienting. They had been told that American abundance was wasteful, that comfort made them weak. Yet here, even in captivity, the enemy fed them better than their own army ever had in the field. Cans of beans, fruit cocktail, and meat hash became symbols of both defeat and revelation. They were the physical proof of what every German officer already feared, that the war had been lost not only on the battlefield, but in the factories and the kitchens of a nation that could outproduce anyone. The C-Ration, despised by the men who ate it daily, had become, unintentionally, one of America's most effective tools of psychological warfare. But the shock went even deeper, because behind every tin lay a truth about industrial civilization itself, one that would haunt the defeated armies long after the fighting stopped. The war was ending, but the revelations were only beginning. Inside sprawling POW camps across Western Europe, Reims, Cherbourg, and later the massive enclosures along the Rhine, German prisoners lined up under gray skies, clutching their tin plates. American soldiers handed them cans and packets, repeating the same quiet instruction: eat, it's food. For many Germans, it was their first encounter with the industrial miracle they had fought against. The tins looked unremarkable: olive paint, block letters, no decoration. Yet to a soldier whose army could no longer issue bread, they were astonishing. Inside was real meat, beans, sugar, even small tins of fruit preserved in syrup. The taste was heavy, greasy, overly sweet, but it was calories, warmth, life. In interviews collected months later by Allied intelligence officers, captured Germans spoke of the same moment with striking similarity. The disbelief, the realization, and then the quiet respect. One lieutenant confessed, "We mocked the Americans for living from cans. But when we saw what those cans meant, that every man, anywhere, could eat, we understood why we lost." The U.S. Army hadn't meant for its rations to be symbolic. Yet they became just that, a compact representation of a society built on scale, science, and foresight. To the Germans, who had glorified hardship and individual will, it was disorienting. America's strength lay in systems, not suffering. Where the Axis had relied on discipline and ideology, the Americans relied on factories, logistics, and a relentless belief that comfort, even in war, was worth producing. Food was no longer about taste. It was about control. In POW camps, guards reported that prisoners often tried to save their empty cans, fascinated by the packaging. Some polished them, others used them as bowls, mirrors, or even keepsakes. The cans bore the stamp of something more powerful than propaganda. Tangible proof that an enemy's everyday sustenance could outlast empires. Japanese prisoners experienced the same awakening in the Pacific. At camps on Guam and the Philippines, captured imperial soldiers, many malnourished, some near death, were astonished at the quality and quantity of American field rations. Reports described them refusing at first, believing the food too rich to be real. Then, after the first taste, silence. One interpreter recalled, "They ate with both hands, and then bowed." The shock wasn't merely about flavor or nutrition, it was cultural. For years, Axis propaganda had painted America as soft, decadent, incapable of hardship. Yet here was proof of a nation that made even its terrible food abundant beyond imagination. In that quiet, after the gunfire had stopped, the truth became impossible to deny. Industrial power had won the war long before the final shot. And in the strange irony of history, the same meal that soldiers had mocked became the final teacher of that lesson. When German prisoners later returned home, they spoke not just of defeat but of astonishment. At the food, the machines, the sheer organization of their captors. Many historians would later note that these impressions shaped post-war admiration for American efficiency and abundance. The C-Ration, greasy, metallic, uninspired, had turned into a quiet emblem of victory. But the war's end brought new questions. What would become of the system that built it? What lessons would soldiers and scientists carry into the peace that followed? When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world surveyed the wreckage. Cities flattened, nations exhausted, and armies disbanding. Yet amid that devastation, one system had not only survived but expanded: the American supply chain. The Quartermaster Corps, which had fed millions of men through deserts, jungles, and frozen forests, had proven a truth as decisive as any battle. Wars are won not only by courage, but by logistics. The humble C-Ration, born from necessity, had become the blueprint for the modern military meal. Within months of victory, the U.S. Army began studying its performance. Reports poured in from every theater: North Africa, Italy, France, the Pacific. Soldiers praised its reliability but criticized its monotony, heaviness, and bulk. Scientists took notes. The result was evolution: the K-Ration for paratroopers, the 10-in-1 for squad distribution, and eventually the post-war meal, combat, individual MCI, the ancestor of today's MREs. The lessons went far beyond food. Industrial planners realized that the same principles that fed soldiers could rebuild nations. The standardized packaging, Mass production and long-distance transport used for wartime rations became models for post-war relief efforts. Under the Marshall Plan, ships once filled with ammunition now carried grain, powdered milk, and canned goods to starving Europe. Many of the same factories that had produced C-Rations for GIs were now filling cans for civilians. To a continent that had known famine, America's efficiency looked almost miraculous. Food, once a weapon of war, became an instrument of peace and diplomacy. The symbolism was not lost on the Germans. In the late 1940s, American occupation forces continued distributing surplus C-Rations to both POWs and civilians. Children in ruined cities lined up for chocolate bars and tins marked U.S. Army. Some later said it was their first real meal in years. To them, those dull green cans meant not humiliation, but hope. Within the U.S. military, the C-Rations endurance became legend. Veterans joked about its taste for decades, yet almost all spoke of it with a strange fondness. It had carried them through hell, through Kasserine and Anzio, Normandy and Okinawa. For every man who cursed it, there was another who quietly credited it for keeping him alive when nothing else could. By the early 1950s, new generations of rations appeared, lighter and more palatable. But none would ever symbolize the era like the C-Ration. It was the ration of total war, of factories running night and day, of convoys stretching to the horizon, of a nation that had learned how to feed an army across oceans. In hindsight, historians often describe it as the taste of victory, though few soldiers at the time would have agreed. Still, its story wasn't finished. Because long after the last can was eaten, the men who had lived on it carried memories that shaped how they saw not only war, but America itself. Those memories, vivid and conflicted, became part of the emotional residue of the war, the taste that lingered when the fighting was done. For the American soldier, the C-Ration became more than a meal. It was a constant companion. It shared his foxhole in France, his tent in North Africa, his landing craft off Saipan. It was there in the rain, the heat, the mud, and the snow. Every GI knew the sound of its tin lid, the smell of cold hash, and the feel of that can in his hand. In letters home, men described it with equal parts humor and hatred. If the army wanted to make us fight harder, one soldier wrote, they should have promised fresh food. Others turned it into comedy. C-Ration stew, C-Ration a la mode, or Spam with mystery sauce. Yet, beneath the jokes there was respect. Because when everything else failed, supply lines, weather, morale, the C-Ration endured. To the Germans and Japanese, its endurance was something close to terrifying. Captured diaries and intelligence reports often noted the same observation. The Americans eat anywhere. They didn't depend on captured towns, foraging, or even kitchens. Their strength came from endless cans that seemed to arrive no matter the distance. One Wehrmacht officer in Italy admitted, they fight on steel tracks and eat from steel tins. How do you stop such a machine? That was the quiet genius behind the C-Ration. It wasn't about taste, it was about time, movement, and survival. It meant a soldier could keep going, and an army could stay mobile. Each can represented the power of American logistics, the invisible line stretching from the kitchen tables of Kansas to the front lines of Europe. After the war, veterans carried that memory into civilian life. For many, the sight of canned food in a grocery store felt strangely familiar, like an echo of the past. The wartime ration had helped fuel the rise of America's post-war food industry. The same preservation techniques, dehydration, vacuum sealing, tinned packaging, became staples of the consumer market. Supermarkets stocked shelves with items that had once been battlefield essentials. Meanwhile, in post-war Germany and Japan, those same soldiers who had once mocked American rations now found themselves working in industries that copied their efficiency. Canning plants reopened using U.S. methods. Food science advanced rapidly thanks to captured Allied research. The practicality once seen as crude was now admired as revolutionary. By the 1960s, the C-Ration was officially phased out. Its replacements were lighter, more nutritious, and slightly better tasting. Yet in museums, veterans' reunions, and old footlockers, the round green cans remained, relics of a time when survival came in steel. Every veteran who opened one knew what it symbolized: the strength of an idea. That an army could be fed not by luxury, but by ingenuity. That victory depended not only on rifles and tanks, but on the ability to sustain men, day after day under impossible conditions. Even those who once called it terrible eventually admitted its strange virtue. It was terrible and it worked. And when German POWs first tasted it in captivity, the irony became complete. The ration they had mocked as crude became the meal that fed them after defeat. In that moment, the C-Ration ceased to be a punchline. It became history, the quiet symbol of a nation that could outthink, outbuild, and outlast its enemies. The story of the C-Ration does not end with its flavor or its tin. It ends with what it represented: endurance, innovation, and the will to feed freedom itself. In the end, the C-Ration was never about taste. It was about endurance. For the American GI, it symbolized the strange contradiction of war, how something so plain, so ordinary, could mean the difference between life and death. It carried the smell of diesel, mud, and cordite. It fed a generation that marched from North Africa's dust to Europe's frozen hedgerows, across Pacific beaches and jungle trails. To the Germans and Japanese, it became a quiet revelation, proof that America's strength wasn't only in its machines or men, but in its system. A nation that could send a hot meal in a can halfway around the world, to every foxhole and every front, was fighting a different kind of war, one powered by industry, ingenuity, and relentless organization. The C-Ration was the taste of that power. Unpleasant, perhaps, but unstoppable. Its legacy still lingers in every modern military meal, every field ration, every humanitarian food drop that feeds people in war zones today. From its humble tin grew a philosophy that logistics and compassion could coexist, that feeding soldiers was as vital as arming them. What began as a soldier's complaint ended as a nation's quiet triumph, a symbol of victory not by flavor, but by foresight. Because in World War II, America didn't just fight harder, fed smarter, and that made all the difference.